Welcome to On Cloud, the podcast for cloud professionals, where we break down the state of cloud computing today and how you can unleash the power of cloud for your enterprise. Now, here's your host, David Linthicum.
Welcome back to the On Cloud podcast. Today on the show, I'm joined by J.R. Stormont, Executive Director at FinOps Foundation, and Mike Fuller, CTO at FinOps Foundation, both of which are co-authors on their new book, Cloud FinOps. So, J.R., Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
I don't think I've ever had guests that are so geographically dispersed, because one of you is in Australia and the other one's in the States, correct?
Yeah, being podcast guest with that distribution is one thing, but writing a book across the gap was another challenging area to cover.
Are you waking Mike up in the middle of the night and vice versa?
Yeah, very early.
Yeah, we had a few weeks where you were like every morning at 4 a.m., weren't we?
Yeah,
impressive. But
I think it's been our long-term relationship, JR, is like constantly time zones completely distant from each other.
So, Mike, let's start with you. How did you come into the FinOps topic, and where'd you come from? What's your background? What kind of led you into writing a book about FinOps?
Yeah, I guess like sort of rewind all the way back to university. I did a little bit of accounting at university and alongside my computer science degree, and then after uni, got into doing sysadmin work, both consulting, and then eventually landed at Atlassian as a sysadmin and sort of helping them with what was on-prem equipment at the beginning. And then as Atlassian went all in on cloud, I sort of transitioned into the Cloud Center of Excellence there at Atlassian. And then I think felt like that sort of bit of little touch of accounting that I did way back when sort of come back to me. And I was starting to really think about the cloud financials and how we can help our finance team at Atlassian make sense of the cloud deal. And then that sort of slowly evolved over a few years with collaboration of others in the industry, including JR, into sort of what is this practice that we're operating on managing cloud spend.
So, JR, same question. How'd you get to FinOps as a topic?
yeah, I spent a lot of years on the vendor side and sort of tooling around this area. And that's where I met Mike, was, sort of helping, manage the spend that they had at Atlassian. And one of the things he and I always connected on over the years of working together was the really hard problem, not really much being the tooling and technology of FinOps and cloud, but really the challenge being the cultural change of how the organization largely needs to reset, how engineers think about cost, and how those finance and accounting types have to understand technology and account for spend in a highly variable, not just OPEX, CAPEX in the accounting sense, but more about the behavioral change of variable spend and how that really adjusts the ways of working in the organization. And so, we came together for the initial version of this book back in late 2018. And, in the last few years, watching the second edition of the book just came out a few months ago, gone from FinOps as a more obscure concept that just the sort of early adopters in cloud were doing and practicing. Folks like Atlassian now, in the FinOps Foundation, we're part of the Linux Foundation, and we've got, I think it's like 88% of the Fortune 50 now have FinOps practices in 2023. And so it's become really a mainstream practice. And the challenge still is the big one that exists, right? Which is, how do you get organizational change and adoption? I just got off the phone with a public company here in the US who we had their CFO and their CIO on the line, and they're negotiating with each other about this new world and how they get their teams working together. And that's really what FinOps is all about.
Yeah, it is. And it's very important right now. It just, there's a recent study that just came out where people are just kind of focused on the efficiencies of the existing system. In 2022, you looked at a lot of the research that certainly we were doing here at Deloitte, but some of the other stuff that popped up is we don't seem to be getting the ROI back from cloud that we originally thought we would get. And, it's, ultimately self-inflicted wounds. And, one of the things we found out in our Future of the Cloud study is that some companies were very successful with cloud and some companies not so successful with cloud. And they're basically spending the amount of the same amount of resources. And those who were successful with cloud had disciplines and culture which were around the accountability of the various systems out there. And those that weren't basically did not have the core disciplines and processes needed to make sure that you're managing these resources in a functional and efficient way. And it sounds pretty rudimentary to me. In other words, the better you manage these resources, the more value that's going to come back from the business. But businesses are just finding this out right now. So we kind of spent, the last 12 years moving in the cloud, certainly the last 3 years during the pandemic, accelerating that because we viewed cloud is a much more safer haven than the existing on-premise systems, didn't put the disciplines in place, didn't put the culture in place to make these things cost effective and cost efficient. And now we're backtracking and putting these systems in. So I'll go to Mike first. Do you think I got that right, or am I overstating the problem?
No, I think it's right. I think a lot of companies, they see the transition to cloud or the cloud transformation to be just an engineering challenge. The effort and the focus really just is how the company transitions their engineering practices into cloud and moves their services there. But it really is, it's a business transformation when you move to cloud. And there's a lot of traditional practices within the organization that need to adopt. The procurement cycle, the financial cycle, these things all change as you move into cloud. And that cultural change is that ownership of cost. We have a principle around everybody taking ownership of their cloud expense. That really does come back to the crux of the transition here that's happening is that, the engineer is taking on the buying power of the business. And it's super important that they understand that transition means that they've got responsibilities. At the same time, the rest of the business needs to understand that things have changed for them in their landscape just as much as engineering has changed as they go to cloud.
So, JR, going to you, do you think the book that you and Mike wrote really kind of addresses FinOps as a cultural people issue, as a technical issue, as a tool issue, as a process issue, or all of the above? Did you approach it in one particular way, or did you approach it in kind of a multidimensional facet?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, we leaned away from cloud or individual technology as much as was possible and tried to lean into, Mike mentioned the principles, but, what fundamentally changes first in a world where everyone has to take ownership for their cloud spend. And the big thing, obviously, with cloud is the highly granular, highly variable nature of that. Now, a lot of the book's focus is about how to start to get a business transformation he talked about, which is getting the seeds in place for this understanding that teams now need to collaborate, not only in new ways, but much, much, much more frequently between the tech teams, business and finance teams, and how to start to get that in place. And it's really sort of, we talk in the book about, the importance of culture change over mandates, because to get that transformation happening where you've got, near real-time data visibility and decision-making around cloud spend decisions to drive business value, you've got to have a top-down, which is, the CIOs, the CFOs, the CTOs, saying, hey, this is really important, not to look at quarterly or on that cycle that we traditionally would with, the hardware we own, but to make, daily decisions and to collaborate around business investment decisions at the technology level, engineers on a daily basis with this highly granular data that we get out of cloud. And then on the groundswell as well, to start to get these teams, engineering teams are a great example in the book. We talk about, how to partner with engineering teams to get them thinking about the business side of things, but to get them also, I hate the expression, sorry, but the shifting left of this expression of let's not think about costs in relation to our infrastructure and our engineering initiatives after we ship the products. Let's start, baking in proactive conversations and decisions into our sprints, into our, architectural reviews about how the different technology decisions we're making are going to affect, right, the outcomes and the costs associated with that. So, the book really kind of starts in about, we see a lot of the core problems, that cloud creates in this, new world, but then how to set up the centralized processes and teams to help support this larger transformation where everybody does take accountability, because it's a lot like the security world, right? Where there will be security is job zero, people say, right? But a lot of the time, FinOps is becoming jobs 0.5, and you need to start baking in those processes and culture changes through central exploration and evangelization of that. But at the same time, it's got to go out where everybody's thinking about it all the time. So yeah, to your question, we sort of take you through that journey a bit of, ultimately, how do you get that in place and then start to, over time, make it a part of the fabric of just how work is done in the organization.
Yeah, the thing is, I think it's all important. In other words, certainly security is important, and cost accountability is important, and sustainability and power consumption management, all these sorts of things that we have to think about as we build the product. One of the things that drives me nuts is when we release something, we can't get in there and re-architect and re-engineer it and make it better after the release. We have to make it during its construction and design these things into how we're building and deploying these products, really kind of the basis of what engineering is. And, I always tell people who are building these systems, if you're not building that into your tool chains, into your software and development processes, into your disciplines, into the culture, which I think is probably the most important thing here, you guys may agree with that, then we're really not going to get to the end state that we're looking to get into. So, Mike, what would you tell a company that's trying to improve and wants to shift left and, start using these processes in a much more disciplined way? Where do they start?
Yeah, so I think, and Jay mentioned that sort of not starting with that mandate, like it's leadership showing that it's important to the business and setting that tone for the rest of the company as far as like this is a practice that needs to be thought about and a process that needs to be baked into the culture. And then at the engineering level, FinOps and engineering shouldn't be sort of seen as oil and water where one just sits on top of the other. It really doesn't need to mix together. So that FinOps is just like the way they operate. And you sort of see this already with things like reliability and the way they do service management, because, they understand that that's the right way to run good and quality services. FinOps is just another metric in that whole process of running good, effective services. So really just sort of figuring out where that understanding is at within the organization and help bring them up to the sort of understanding how FinOps is helping both the engineering and company at large. And then once you've got everybody on board of what the goal of FinOps is, it's not there to slow down the engineers, and it's not just to save money. It's for the company to be making the right decisions around cloud spend and moving fast, but with caution, with a certain level of intentional decision making. And so I think I would focus more on that, on where you're at with that and getting that message out, and then starting to build out the actual capabilities of FinOps within the org.
So, GR, we're looking at like kind of the tactical aspects of it and the cultural changes and, building these things into the existing infrastructure so people have the accountability and part of the process, doing so in the right way. Is there a story to be told about how we're abstracting this up into the people who are running finance, to the people who work in the CFO office, the people who are looking to figure out in some sort of a metrics and how we measure value that's coming back from IT and cloud computing specifically? Is there a story to be told there?
Yeah, I mean, two things that stand out around that story. I mean, you mentioned the value aspect. In the first version of the book, we actually ended it with the really nirvana state that you want to get to there is unit economics, where you're, looking at cloud spend in relation to some business value output metric, right? I mean, the simplified version is percentage of revenue for like a SaaS company, but for, a larger organization, it could be, the cost for a customer or, the cost for an individual function or some sort of activity-based output. But in the latest version of the book, as we talked to more companies over the last few years doing this at scale, we realized that, business value unit economic view of this, which is, what are we getting out for the spend, is important, but it's not necessarily the nirvana state. It's another input to this larger thing, which is data-driven decision-making that isn't happening on that infrequent basis we talked about, but is really happening, every day by all the thousands of little decisions that are being made in engineering teams in relation to infrastructure, but also in their collaboration, right, with those finance teams. And the concept that came out through a lot of the interviews with the latest version of the book was around putting data in the path of the engineer. Was that core concept of how do we get cloud spend data and how do we not inundate them with too much information? Here's the 83 billion charges this month, but getting filtered, actionable information at the right level into the new workflows, right, of engineering teams. But then also we realized that data in the path of really applies to all these other personas as well, right? How do we start to get meaningful cloud spend data categorized, normalized, and mapped into an organization, right, in a way that the business teams can understand and report on? And a lot of the work now in the FinOps Foundation we're doing is around things like normalizing cloud spend. We have a open source project called Focus, which is the FinOps open cost and usage spec, which we're seeing organizations look at, say, okay, how do I align my cloud spend between all the different CSPs out there? And then how do I align that with maybe even my SaaS spending? How do I start to get a consistent view of this that is not technology specific, but really, helps me understand why this money is going somewhere, what we're spending, so we can start to have the business conversation of is it the right investment? And to the point of not necessarily slowing down cloud spend or cloud adoption, like how can we be more confident in those decisions so that as we're using cloud to launch products and deliver services to customers, we can do that more confidently.
So, Mike, one of the things I get from my clients all the time when I talk about any kind of new technology, FinOps or, multi-cloud, whatever, they always want to know, what are the steps to success? In other words, what do I have to go through to start implementing these programs? What would you say would be the first three major steps that enterprises need to go through to establish a proper FinOps program?
Yeah, so I think, as I said before, the figuring out where the understanding is in the business of what FinOps is and its goals. Starting with that, we have this concept of a FinOps practitioner. So this is, either someone existing in your organization or someone you've hired in to help with the FinOps process. And for, our large spenders, they end up with a whole FinOps team, which is a collection of different roles that sort of work as a FinOps team. And they're there not to do FinOps for the organization, but enable the business to do FinOps. And so kind of much like DevOps isn't just one role that you have, sitting in the corner on one desk. It's like a way of operations. FinOps is the same thing, but the FinOps practitioner is there to really help identify, how to bring FinOps to the organization, how to enable the engineers, how to gather the right cloud billing data. It's a complex topic in itself. The cloud bills often surprisingly big for traditional finance folk, and having that skill set there built out in the organization and those sort of evangelizers happening, across the business between the elements, and then sort of starting to build out the process of bringing people together to open the conversation. So, you want to be setting up those regular meetings between product leaders and finance and engineering teams, so that there is that opening channel of collaboration. It's like JR said, you can't wait until the end of quarter and then have a conversation. You want these things to be happening a lot more frequently and a lot more targeted around those business decisions, those value decisions.
So, JR, one of the things that I think people get enamored with and focused on is tooling. And obviously, there's a lot in the FinOps world. There's a lot of FinOps observability tooling and cost monitoring systems, and basically lots of different things that enable FinOps to work, and around some of the processes. When should they focus on tooling when deploying a FinOps program? Obviously, not up front, but when should it come in?
Yeah, tooling is a very tricky thing, right? And we actually did a deep dive into build versus buy versus native and all those options in there. I mean, tooling is definitely part of the three-legged stool, right? Of people, process, technology. Typically, the pattern we see people go through, and there's on state of FinOps data, we did kind of a deep dive in our survey as well of, where people start and, which tooling and all those areas. But the process typically is start with the native tools, right? Because you want to get the information straight from the cloud provider mouth, around what service is doing, what you can get out of that, the data. Often we see, as practices advance, there is often the build versus buy conversation come in, right? Which is all about, figuring out what information we want to pull into the various dashboards and reporting and all those areas. And there's a bunch of platform vendors out there who are tackling this from all different angles right now. But ultimately, the sort of larger, more advanced practice state, we see a combination where people are often using a platform, they're pulling in cloud native data. They're often doing what we call buy and augment approach, right? Where they're taking maybe a platform and they're pulling in other information or pushing it out. Because ultimately, we've seen with all the tooling conversations and providers is that it's really not about how good the tool is. It's about how well it's implemented into the organization. And this is where we get to that aspect of getting the data into the path, right? Into the path of the engineers, the business teams, the finance teams. And how do we get people not so much having to go look at tooling today to understand what is happening with my cloud spend, but that tooling or native data coming into their workflows, which is where that cultural bit happens. So I think it's really important to get arms around it early on and to make decisions about it. But ultimately, getting the teams to be able to understand the data underneath the tooling, to understand what actions to take on it, and to get, to a place where you have some agreed processes, governments or otherwise over, when tooling says this, I'm going to take these actions. And it's a long process, right? You can't just drop in a tool or a bit of data and make that change. It's got to be getting alignment between disparate teams to say, what are we going to do on the back of that?
So, Mike, ultimately, we're focusing on the core processes. We're focusing on culture. We're focusing on understanding what FinOps is and getting to the value and how it's implemented. We're focusing on lots of things that I think that people don't like to focus on. They like to focus on tools and technology, and then pushing rules and regulations down internal within the company. But this is about you driving success by leveraging technology in a way that's going to be a bit more finesse, for lack of a better word, than traditional technology implementations. Am I off kilter with that?
Yeah, I think it's just that understanding that usually, especially with organizations that have gone, headlong into cloud without really thinking about FinOps at all, it's often felt like FinOps is pulling back or putting down controls and slowing things down. But I think when implemented correctly, engineers feel like way more empowered, that they feel more confident that they're not going to be pulled up later. We're getting the more proactive, being able to set the expectations on things at the architecting phase, at the design phases. So teams feel really able to use technology in the ways they want to use it and know that it's not going to, be outstepped with the business. And when it comes to goals, I think if you ask engineers what their goals are, they're going to talk about having reliable, highly, stable services for their customers and good performance. Finance teams are going to want to make sure that they understand investments in things like cloud, and the business is feeling confident with the business direction. And I think when you sort of pull those goals together and get the teams to think about what's the overarching goal, it's really around having a successful business. And so when you realize that you might have some individual domain-specific goals, you're all there for one overarching goal for the business success. So once you align people around that business success and then realize that when done properly, this is really just freeing people up to make sure that they feel confident that the things they're doing is really helping towards that overarching goal. It just aligns things. So tooling and processes really just comes down to how can we make that more efficient for us to implement the way we approach FinOps and the way we implement business decision making.
So JR, a question for both of you, but I'm going to go to JR first. What do you think the primary takeaway should be as someone reads the book? What do you think in your mind that the primary theme they're going to take away from reading the book in terms of how they're applying FinOps within their own enterprise?
No, that's a really good question. I wish there was one simple answer to how to magically drop in the FinOps practice, but I think the takeaway really is that it's a long journey to get on. That does involve changing a lot in the organization. It involves getting in a lot, sometimes new tooling. It involves training up a lot of people. But the takeaway really at the end is that it does come down to the people in the organization and their upskilling of those individuals to work in new ways. It comes down to, you asked earlier about tooling, and, forecasting is a great example in the cloud world of this hard journey you got to go on, because can you get some tooling or run, an algorithm to figure out, how your cloud spend is going to grow? Yes. But ultimately you've got to factor in human behaviors and new business deliverables and things shipping and go between a lot of different teams to pull together information to figure out, how is my cloud spend going to grow over time? And getting that change in place, requires a long process. I mean, we've seen in 10 years of watching different forms of FinOps practices now, you've seen people go from one organization to the next and try and sort of restart the practice, from where they were. And FinOps is kind of like installing an immune system into an organization. It takes, you can put in some basic protections, but it takes it interacting with the environment of the cloud, interacting with the business and learning and evolving over time. And what we've seen is that, it really is about building this muscle of learning, communication, collaboration, data visibility that drives these business decisions. And I think the takeaway is to get started, early and to understand that there's a long road ahead and that we don't really meet one organization that has it all figured out. FinOps' practice is evolving. It's not about, you can't say one organization is at a run state and another is at a crawl state. There's 18 different capabilities that you need to build, and each may be at different states of maturity in the organization, but there may be also very different states of maturity for each part of the organization, each business unit. So I think, investing in the people, in the training and education of those people is really the key takeaway, because it is, at the end of the day, not so much a technology FinOps as much as it is a cultural practice and a people practice that has to evolve over time.
So where can we find more information about you, the authors, and also where can we find the book? Mike, I'm going to go to you first.
The book, is available through most of the good book retailers, especially the ones online. And I've transitioned from Atlassian in the last over the year boundary, and I'm now the CTO at the FinOps Foundation. So you'll find myself there hanging out with JR, FinOps.org, and enjoy having more people join the community and join the conversation.
So JR, where can we find you?
Yeah, FinOps.org is our home online, but I think where we'd love to see everybody is, we've got our annual conference coming up, FinOpsX in San Diego, where we're getting together about 1,000 practitioners from around the world to share best practices and learnings and stories. So, find me in San Diego at the end of June at FinOpsX would be would be ideal. That's where we'll all be sharing the stories.
Yeah, check them out. FinOps is a hot topic right now, as you saw by the surveys that we just talked about. And it's a problem that everybody has that we need to solve and figure out a way to do it right the first time. So if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to like us, rate us, and subscribe. You can also check out our past episodes, including those hosted by my good friend, Mike Cavas. Find out more at DeloitteCloudPodcast.com, all one word. If you'd like to contact me directly, you can email me at dlinthicum, that's LINTHICUM, at Deloitte.com. So until next time, best of luck with your cloud journey. Everybody stay safe. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to On Cloud for Cloud Professionals with David Linthicum. Connect with David on Twitter and LinkedIn. And visit the Deloitte on Cloud blog at Deloitte.com/US/Deloitte-on-cloud-blog. Be sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to Deloitte.com/about.